John Reynolds had driven countless miles across the country, but tonight felt different. As a seasoned long-haul truck driver, he was well accustomed to the solitude of the open road. However, the remote highway he found himself on this crisp autumn night had an unsettling quality. The air was unusually still, almost as if holding its breath. The trees, barren and skeletal in the moonlight, seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The road was shrouded in a thick fog, its swirling mist catching the headlights and casting an eerie glow. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional whoosh of the wind and the steady hum of the truck's engine. John's only company was the rhythmic ticking of the dashboard clock, each tick sounding louder in the oppressive quiet. Around midnight, as John maneuvered a particularly sharp curve, the beam of his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside. The sudden appearance was so jarring that John almost swerved. He squinted through the fog and saw a young woman, her form slightly hunched, her clothes in tatters, and her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her silhouette was almost ghostly, and the way she stood there so still and silent was unnerving. He wrestled with his instincts, which screamed at him to drive on and ignore the hitchhiker. However, his sense of empathy won over his fear. John rolled down the window, trying to dispel the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice trying to sound casual but betraying a hint of nervousness. The woman didn't respond verbally but took a step forward, her face still hidden. The fog swirled around her, making it difficult to see her clearly. John's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her climb into the truck. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he forced himself to focus on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. As the woman settled into the passenger seat, John stole glances at her from the corner of his eye. Her clothes were old and worn, as if they had seen better days decades ago. The chill in the air seemed to emanate from her, and despite the truck's heater working overtime, John couldn't shake the cold that had crept into the cab. The silence inside the truck grew more pronounced as the minutes ticked by. The woman sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. John tried to break the silence with small talk, asking where she was headed, if she had been waiting long, but she didn't respond. Her eyes, though hidden beneath the brim of her hat, seemed to be fixed on some point far beyond the windshield. John's attempts to make conversation only seemed to deepen the silence. Each question he asked was met with an unspoken response. The atmosphere in the truck grew heavier, the silence almost tangible. John found himself glancing at the woman more frequently, trying to catch a glimpse of her face, but her hat and the dim lighting made it impossible. As the hours passed, the road became more desolate, the fog thicker. The only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the truck's engine and the occasional creak of the vehicle as it navigated the winding path. The sense of unease continued to grow, a feeling that they were being watched, even though there was no one else in sight. John tried to shake off the discomfort by focusing on the road, but the woman's presence was unnervingly distracting. He could feel his heart rate quickening, and his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. The fog seemed to press in from all sides, and the road ahead stretched on interminably, as if leading them into some unknown void. When John finally decided to take a break, he hoped it might dispel the growing sense of dread. He pulled into a desolate rest stop that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The rest stop was little more than a run-down shelter with a few old benches and a grimy vending machine. The place looked abandoned, with no sign of life except for the flickering light bulbs that cast eerie shadows across the area. John turned off the engine and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He glanced over at the passenger seat, expecting to see the woman sitting there. To his shock and horror, the seat was empty. The woman had vanished without a trace. John's heart raced as he scrambled out of the truck, his flashlight slicing through the thick darkness. He called out, but his voice echoed emptily, swallowed by the vast silence. The rest stop was deserted. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a nightbird. John shone his flashlight around, searching for any sign of the woman, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign of her presence. The truck was completely still, the eerie silence only interrupted by the occasional creak of the old structure. Panic set in as John realized he had no idea how far they had traveled or where he was. The rest stop offered no clues, only the cold, oppressive darkness. His flashlight beam swept over the area, revealing nothing but shadows. The fog seemed to be closing in, and the air grew colder. He felt an icy chill run down his spine as he searched the area. Determined to find answers, John got back into the truck, hoping to retrace his route. He drove slowly, the fog obscuring his vision and making the road seem like an endless labyrinth. The headlights barely cut through the mist and the darkness outside felt alive, almost like it was watching him. As he drove, he spotted a dim light in the distance, another rest stop, but this one looked older, more decrepit. He pulled over, hoping to find some help or at least a clue. The light came from a single flickering lantern hanging outside a dilapidated shack. John approached cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Inside, the shack was filled with old, dusty furniture and broken relics from a bygone era. At the center of the room was an old, cracked mirror. John's heart skipped a beat as he saw the reflection of the woman standing behind him, her face pale and eyes hollow. He spun around, but there was no one there. The mirror's reflection was empty, and the room was as deserted as before. Feeling increasingly unnerved, John stepped outside and looked around. The fog had thickened, and the chill in the air was biting. He could see the distant glow of headlights, but they seemed to be moving away. Desperate, he jumped back into the truck and tried to follow the lights, but they remained just out of reach, flickering in and out of sight. The hours passed in a blur as John continued to drive, the road seeming to stretch on endlessly. The fog had become so dense that he could barely see a few feet ahead. The truck's headlights cut through the mist, but the road remained elusive, twisting and turning without end. As he drove, John noticed something strange. The road signs, which had been clear and legible before, were now faded and illegible. He couldn't tell if he was driving in circles or if the road had simply changed. The feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. Suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered and died. John's heart sank as he realized he was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no sign of civilization. He tried to restart the engine, but it was futile. The truck remained motionless, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows in the fog. In the silence that followed, John heard something that made his blood run cold. A faint, ghostly whisper carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably mournful, filled with despair. The whisper seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the fog. He felt a cold hand of fear grip his heart as he sat there, paralyzed by the sense of impending doom. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift, revealing a scene that John could barely comprehend. The road ahead was no longer the same. It had transformed into a narrow, overgrown path, flanked by ancient, twisted trees that seemed to close in on him. John decided to get out of the truck and try to find help. He walked down the path, each step feeling heavier than the last. The trees seemed to whisper secrets as he passed, their branches swaying as if trying to guide him or keep him from moving forward. Eventually, he reached an old, abandoned farmhouse. The structure was dilapidated, with broken windows and a sagging roof. He approached cautiously, hoping to find someone who could help him. Inside, the farmhouse was eerily quiet, filled with dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a dusty old photograph framed and mounted on the wall. John's blood ran cold as he recognized the photograph. It was of the woman who had ridden in his truck. Below her picture was a plaque with a date from many years ago. The inscription read, "In memory of Emily Turner, who vanished on this road." John's breath came in ragged gasps as the realization dawned on him. Emily Turner had been dead for decades. The hitchhiker was a ghost, forever trapped in a cycle of seeking help on that desolate highway. John had unknowingly driven into a haunted realm, and he was lucky to have escaped with his life. As he stumbled out of the farmhouse, the sun's rays finally broke through the fog, illuminating the road back to safety. But John knew he would never forget the chilling encounter, or the ghostly hitchhiker who had forever altered his view of the open road. Rachel and her friends were on a road trip, eager to explore the remote countryside. They had planned their route carefully, but as night fell, they found themselves lost on an unfamiliar road. The GPS had lost signal, and the map they relied on seemed outdated. The only thing guiding them was the faint glow of their headlights and the occasional road sign that seemed increasingly worn. The road they were on was narrow and winding, flanked by dense woods on either side. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The air was thick with humidity, and the night was filled with the distant sounds of wildlife. Rachel felt a growing sense of unease as they drove deeper into the woods. "Are you sure this is the right way?" one of her friends asked, peering out the window. Rachel tried to reassure them, but her own apprehension was mounting. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of civilization or a way to turn back. As they rounded a sharp bend, the headlights revealed an old, weathered sign that read, "Welcome to Blackwood." The name sent a shiver down Rachel's spine, but she tried to dismiss it as a mere coincidence. They continued driving, hoping to find their way back to a more familiar route. Just as Rachel began to despair, they spotted a flickering light in the distance. It looked like a gas station or a small diner, something that might offer directions or assistance. They pulled up to the building, which was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." Rachel and her friends hesitated for a moment, but decided to investigate. The inside of the diner was dimly lit, with dusty tables and old, worn-out chairs. The air smelled musty, and the only sound was the soft hum of the old neon sign. The place seemed frozen in time, as if it had been abandoned for years. A middle-aged man with a weathered face and a gruff demeanor emerged from the back room. He greeted them with a nod and a terse, "What can I do for you?" Rachel explained their situation, and the man listened without comment. After a few moments, he handed them a tattered map and pointed them toward the back exit. "Follow the road until you reach the end," he said. "But be careful. This road isn't what it seems." His cryptic warning only added to their unease, but they thanked him and left the diner, eager to get back on track. As they continued down the road, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and the road twisted and turned unpredictably. The map they had been given seemed to be of no use, as the roads marked on it did not match their surroundings. Rachel's friends grew increasingly anxious, and the tension in the car was palpable. They tried to keep their spirits up by joking and chatting, but the uneasy feeling persisted. The fog began to roll in, thickening and obscuring their view. The headlights barely cut through the mist, and the road seemed to vanish into the darkness. Suddenly, the car's engine sputtered and died. Rachel's heart sank as she tried to restart it, but it was no use. The car remained motionless, the headlights casting eerie shadows on the fog-covered road. They were stranded, with no sign of the diner or any other form of assistance. The group decided to explore on foot, hoping to find a nearby town or a more substantial road. They walked for what felt like hours, but the fog seemed to wrap around them, distorting their sense of direction. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional distant howl of an unknown creature. As they wandered through the fog, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. The structure was decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the porch was littered with debris. Despite the creepy appearance, they decided to investigate, hoping to find some clue about their location. Inside, the house was filled with dust and cobwebs. Old furniture lay covered in sheets, and the air was heavy with the smell of mildew. As they explored the house, they found an old journal lying on a dusty table. The journal's pages were filled with strange symbols and disjointed ramblings about lost souls and a cursed road. Rachel's friends were growing more frightened by the minute. The eerie atmosphere of the house, combined with the unsettling journal, had taken its toll. They decided to leave and continue their search for help. But as they exited the house, they noticed something horrifying. The fog had thickened, and the road they had been following had disappeared, leaving them surrounded by an impenetrable wall of mist. As the fog began to lift slightly, they realized they were no longer on the same road. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by an unfamiliar landscape of twisted trees and broken ruins. The once clear path was now a maze of winding trails and dead ends. It was as if they had been transported to another world, one that defied logic and reason. Panic set in as they realized they were completely disoriented. The map they had been given was nowhere to be found, and their sense of direction was entirely lost. They tried to retrace their steps, but the fog seemed to play tricks on their minds, making them feel as though they were walking in circles. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way, and they found themselves tumbling down a steep incline. They landed in a small clearing, surrounded by strange glowing plants and eerie spectral figures that seemed to hover just out of reach. The figures whispered in a language they couldn't understand, their voices echoing through the clearing. Desperate to escape, Rachel and her friends tried to find a way out of the clearing. They stumbled upon an old, weathered sign that read, "Exit," in faded letters. Following the sign, they climbed a steep hill and emerged onto a road that looked strangely familiar. The fog had lifted, and the night seemed to be fading. As they drove away from the cursed road, they looked back and saw the fog rolling in once more, swallowing the twisted path and the haunted house. The night air was cool and the road ahead seemed normal, devoid of the supernatural presence they had experienced. Rachel and her friends never spoke of that night again. They avoided the area entirely, and the road they had traveled was forever etched in their memories as a place of nightmares and lost souls. The encounter had left them with a deep sense of unease, a reminder of the thin veil that separates reality from the unknown. Lucas had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. Willow Creek Manor was a relic of the past, its grandeur faded by years of neglect. Locals whispered about the place, telling tales of hauntings and strange occurrences, but Lucas never put much stock in such stories. To him, it was just an empty house with a lot of history. When an unexpected letter arrived in his mailbox, inviting him to spend a night at Willow Creek Manor, he couldn't resist. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect. It spoke of a large sum of money offered to anyone who could last a single night within the manor's walls. Lucas saw it as a challenge, a way to prove to himself and others that there was no such thing as ghosts. On the night of his stay, Lucas arrived at the manor just as the sun was setting. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and empty, like eyes watching his every move. The front door creaked open as if it had been expecting him. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, Lucas stepped inside. The interior was even more impressive than he'd imagined. Grand chandeliers hung from the ceilings, their crystals catching the last rays of sunlight. Dust-covered furniture hinted at the house's former glory, but something about the place felt off, like the air was too thick, too still. As Lucas explored the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and he could swear he heard whispers echoing through the empty halls, but he pushed the thoughts aside, chalking it up to his imagination running wild in the eerie setting. He found a grand bedroom upstairs with a large canopy bed and a fireplace that still had logs stacked inside. Deciding this would be his base for the night, he set up his things and settled in, determined to prove that the house was nothing more than a decaying old building. As the night wore on, the manor seemed to come alive around him. The once silent halls were now filled with strange noises, creaking floorboards, distant footsteps, and the occasional soft knock on the walls. Lucas tried to ignore it, focusing on reading a book he'd brought along, but the noises grew louder, more insistent, as if the house was trying to get his attention. Around midnight, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Lucas shivered, feeling a cold breeze brush against his skin. He looked up from his book and saw that the bedroom door, which he had closed, was now slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness stretched from the hallway into the room, and in that darkness he saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, barely noticeable, but then it grew, taking on a more defined shape. A figure stood just outside the door, watching him. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the apparition. It was a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face hidden in shadow. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. Summoning all his courage, Lucas called out to the figure, "Who are you? What do you want?" His voice echoed through the room, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly and glided down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. Lucas hesitated for a moment before getting up and following her. His footsteps were loud against the creaky floorboards, but the woman made no sound as she moved. She led him through the winding corridors of the manor, down a spiral staircase and into the basement. The basement was cold and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mold. Lucas's breath came out in white puffs as he descended, the woman always just out of reach. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped in front of an old wooden door, half rotted from years of neglect. She turned to face him, her eyes now visible, deep, hollow voids that seemed to stare into his soul. With a trembling hand, Lucas reached out and opened the door. Behind the door was a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and in the center of the room stood a large stone altar. On top of the altar were old, yellowed bones arranged in a grotesque display, as if part of some ancient ritual. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what he was looking at. A makeshift tomb hidden away beneath the manor. The bones were human, long dead and forgotten, left to decay in the darkness. But there was something more, something that made his blood run cold. The woman stood beside the altar, her ghostly form now more defined, her face clearer. She was beautiful, but her expression was one of sorrow and anger. Lucas knew without needing to be told that these bones belonged to her. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him as the woman began to speak, not with words, but with emotions, anger, betrayal, pain. All of it flooded into Lucas's mind. She had been murdered, her life taken in some cruel act, and her remains hidden away to cover up the crime. The manor had been her prison ever since, her spirit trapped by the unresolved injustice. Suddenly the room began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling as the walls groaned in protest. Lucas felt a force pulling him back, away from the altar, away from the woman. He stumbled, trying to resist, but it was no use. The door slammed shut, and the last thing he saw was the woman's sorrowful eyes before darkness swallowed him whole. Lucas woke up in the grand bedroom, the morning sun streaming through the windows. For a moment he thought it had all been a dream, until he noticed the dirt under his fingernails and the faint scent of decay lingering in the air. He quickly gathered his things and left the manor, the experience too fresh, too real to process. As he drove away from Willow Creek Manor, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that he had been part of something much bigger than himself. The woman's story, her pain, and her need for justice haunted him. He knew he couldn't just leave it behind, not after what he had seen. Over the next few weeks, Lucas began to research the history of Willow Creek Manor. What he uncovered was a dark and twisted tale of greed, murder, and betrayal. The manor had once belonged to a wealthy family, the Bakers, who had mysteriously disappeared one night. The case had never been solved, and the manor had been left to rot, along with the secrets it held. Lucas's investigation led him to an old newspaper article from the time of the Bakers' disappearance. The article mentioned a young woman who had been involved with the family, a maid who had gone missing around the same time. Her name was Emily, and the description matched the ghostly figure Lucas had encountered. Determined to bring closure to the woman who had suffered so much, Lucas returned to the manor, this time with the authorities. Together, they uncovered the hidden basement and the remains that had been left there for decades. The discovery made headlines, and the story of Emily Baker finally came to light. With the truth revealed, Lucas hoped that Emily's spirit would finally find peace, but deep down, he knew that the horrors of Willow Creek Manor would never truly fade. The house was a place of darkness, and its history would continue to haunt those who dared to enter its doors. After a grueling day on the road, Kevin, a truck driver, found himself desperately in need of rest. His shift had been longer than expected, and he was exhausted. As night fell and the stars blinked into view, he spotted a small, rundown motel just off the highway. It looked like a typical roadside stop, complete with a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy." The motel's appearance was slightly unsettling, but Kevin was too tired to care. He pulled into the parking lot, which was eerily empty, save for a few stray cats darting between the overgrown bushes. The office was dimly lit, and an old-fashioned bell jingled as he entered. A surly clerk, with a scruffy beard and a disinterested demeanor, handed Kevin a key to room 12. He mentioned that the room was the last available for the night, and advised Kevin to lock the door tightly. Kevin, still half asleep, nodded absently and took the key. The room was as worn and shabby as the rest of the motel. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, and the bedspread looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. Kevin shrugged it off, too tired to care about the grimy surroundings. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto the bed, falling into a deep sleep almost immediately. Kevin was jolted awake in the dead of night by an unsettling noise. It sounded like muffled voices coming from the other side of the wall. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, and listened carefully. The voices were indistinct but seemed to be arguing. He got out of bed and walked to the wall, pressing his ear against it. The voices grew louder, more intense. It sounded like a heated discussion, punctuated by occasional bursts of angry shouting. Kevin glanced around the room, noticing that the wallpaper was beginning to peel away from the walls in places, revealing old, faded designs beneath. Deciding to investigate, Kevin stepped outside his room and walked down the dimly lit corridor. The air was cold and heavy, and the flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. He approached room 13, the source of the noises, and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. The voices were now almost deafening, filled with desperation and fury. As Kevin pushed the door open, the voices abruptly stopped. He stepped into the room, which was eerily quiet and empty. The room appeared to be in the same dilapidated state as his own, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. The only difference was the unsettling presence of an old dusty mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. After a grueling day on the road, Kevin, a truck driver, found himself desperately in need of rest. His shift had been longer than expected, and he was exhausted. As night fell and the stars blinked into view, he spotted a small, run-down motel just off the highway. It looked like a typical roadside stop, complete with a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy." The motel's appearance was slightly unsettling, but Kevin was too tired to care. He pulled into the parking lot, which was eerily empty, save for a few stray cats darting between the overgrown bushes. The office was dimly lit, and an old-fashioned bell jingled as he entered. A surly clerk, with a scruffy beard and a disinterested demeanor, handed Kevin a key to room 12. He mentioned that the room was the last available for the night, and advised Kevin to lock the door tightly. Kevin, still half asleep, nodded absently and took the key. The room was as worn and shabby as the rest of the motel. The carpet was stained, the wallpaper peeling, and the bedspread looked like it hadn't been replaced in decades. Kevin shrugged it off, too tired to care about the grimy surroundings. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and collapsed onto the bed, falling into a deep sleep almost immediately. Kevin was jolted awake in the dead of night by an unsettling noise. It sounded like muffled voices coming from the other side of the wall. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, and listened carefully. The voices were indistinct but seemed to be arguing. He got out of bed and walked to the wall, pressing his ear against it. The voices grew louder, more intense. It sounded like a heated discussion, punctuated by occasional bursts of angry shouting. Kevin glanced around the room, noticing that the wallpaper was beginning to peel away from the walls in places, revealing old, faded designs beneath. Deciding to investigate, Kevin stepped outside his room and walked down the dimly lit corridor. The air was cold and heavy, and the flickering overhead lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. He approached room 13, the source of the noises, and noticed that the door was slightly ajar. The voices were now almost deafening, filled with desperation and fury. As Kevin pushed the door open, the voices abruptly stopped. He stepped into the room, which was eerily quiet and empty. The room appeared to be in the same dilapidated state as his own, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell. The only difference was the unsettling presence of an old, dusty mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Kevin noticed a note taped to the mirror. It was hastily scrawled in a shaky hand. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." The message sent chills down his spine. He turned to leave, but as he did, the door slammed shut behind him. He tried to open it, but it was locked tight. Panic set in as he pounded on the door, yelling for help. The voices started again, but this time, they were accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps. Kevin could hear the muffled cries of someone pleading for help, mixed with the sinister laughter of unseen entities. Desperate to escape, Kevin searched the room for another exit. The mirror on the wall began to ripple, and an otherworldly figure materialized within it. The figure was a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, staring directly at Kevin with a mournful expression. The man's mouth moved silently, as if trying to communicate something through the mirror. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Kevin's breath became visible in the icy air. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows around the room twisted into grotesque shapes. The mirror's surface distorted further, and Kevin saw flashes of scenes from the motel's past. Screaming guests, ghostly figures, and violent confrontations. The man in the mirror raised his hand, pointing to a hidden panel behind the wallpaper. Kevin scrambled to remove the peeling wallpaper, revealing a small, concealed compartment. Inside, he found a set of old photographs and a diary. The diary belonged to a previous motel guest who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The entries detailed a series of horrific events, including encounters with malevolent spirits and strange occurrences within the motel. The final entry was a frantic plea for someone to escape and warn others about the malevolent forces lurking in the motel. With the diary in hand, Kevin realized that he needed to escape before the spirits claimed him. He frantically searched for a way out, but the room seemed to warp and change, making it impossible to find a clear path. The voices grew louder and more chaotic, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. The mirror continued to ripple, and the figure within it began to scream silently. Kevin's fear reached a crescendo as the room was overtaken by a violent, supernatural storm. Objects flew around the room and the air crackled with malevolent energy. Kevin's only chance was to follow the instructions in the diary. He recalled a passage that mentioned a hidden exit concealed behind a loose floorboard. He searched the room until he found the board and pried it open, revealing a narrow, hidden passageway. Kevin crawled through the passage, which was cramped and dark. The sounds of the haunting voices and supernatural storm were muffled but still present, adding to his sense of urgency. The passage led him to a small, forgotten service entrance at the back of the motel. As he emerged from the passage, he was greeted by the cool night air and the distant hum of highway traffic. The motel's facade looked different now, more decrepit and foreboding. Kevin glanced back and saw the motel's neon sign flickering erratically, as if it were struggling to maintain its presence. He didn't stop to look back again. He ran to his truck, started the engine, and drove away at breakneck speed. The road behind him seemed to stretch on forever, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting as far away from the haunted motel as possible. As he finally reached the safety of the highway, Kevin felt a sense of relief wash over him. The nightmare was over, but the haunting memories of that night would linger with him forever. He vowed never to stop at a roadside motel again, no matter how desperate he might be.